For 86 years, the Upper Columbia River was silent. Its salmon runs wiped out by a dam so massive it severed an ancient lifeline. When Canada released 8,000 salmon fry into what had become a dead river, experts and entire nations doubted they would ever return. But 2 years later, something happened that no one dared predict. What did these fish reveal about the fate of a forgotten ecosystem? And why did their journey spark a reckoning that could transform the river's future? In 1939, the Grand Coulee Dam rose from the Columbia River Valley, a concrete wall stretching over 4,000 feet long and standing more than 500 feet high. Its construction demanded nearly a decade of labor and more than 12 million cubic yards of concrete, dwarfing anything built in North America before. When the last bucket of concrete was poured, the river's course was changed forever. The dam's reservoir, Lake Roosevelt, swallowed entire valleys and submerged ancient salmon spawning grounds beneath deep, cold water. There were no fish ladders. No passage was built for the millions of salmon that once surged upstream each year. The river's upper reaches in British Columbia, where salmon had returned for thousands of years, were cut off in a single engineering decision, even as the turbines began to spin, delivering electricity and irrigation water across the Pacific Northwest. The migration routes that had shaped the region's ecology and culture vanished overnight. The Grand Coulee Dam became an immovable barrier. For the salmon, it was the end of the line. For the Indigenous nations who depended on those runs, it was the loss of a living connection to the land and water. The river above the dam fell silent, its ancient pulse broken not by drought or famine, but by the weight of concrete and the priorities of a new era. The silence that followed the damming of the Columbia was not just the absence of fish, it was the hollowing out of a way of life. For the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Ktunaxa nations, the river had always been a living thread, carrying salmon upstream each year, a gift that fed families, shaped ceremonies, and anchored identity. Without the salmon, diets shifted to whatever could be gathered or hunted, but nothing filled the missing space left by a vanished staple that once made up half of what people ate. In stories, elders spoke of the river's bounty, but for generations, children only knew the emptiness. The ecosystem suffered alongside the people. In the years after the dams, the Upper Columbia's headwaters grew poor in nutrients. Where salmon carcasses once fed forests and fueled the food web, the land became thin and quiet. Eagles and bears found less to eat. Even the trees lining the banks lost the richness that salmon brought from the sea. The river, once alive with movement and memory, became a corridor of loss. Yet the grief did not fade into resignation. Across decades, the nations refused to let the silence become permanent. They gathered at the banks to remember, to mourn, and to promise that the river would not be forgotten. The absence of salmon became a call, a shared resolve to restore what was lost, not just for themselves, but for the land and all its living relatives. In 2019, leaders from the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Ktunaxa nations gathered to launch a new kind of restoration effort. They called it Bringing the Salmon Home. For generations, their communities had watched the Upper Columbia remain empty, but their vision was not just about fish. It was about restoring a relationship, a duty to the river, to ancestors, and to future generations. The initiative was built on Indigenous knowledge councils, where elders, knowledge holders, and community members shaped every decision. Each nation brought its own protocols, languages, and ceremonies, weaving them together into a collective approach that crossed borders and bureaucracies. Judson Thomas, a working group member, described the intent. "This is for our grandchildren, for the river, and for all our relations." The plan was never to simply restock fish. It meant honoring creation stories, respecting the laws of the land, and addressing the wounds left by colonization. The Knowledge Council set out guidelines that would guide not just the return of salmon, but the health of the entire basin. Partnerships with the Canadian and British Columbia governments brought in scientific tools, genetic analysis, tagging, and monitoring, but the direction remained firmly in Indigenous hands. Decisions were made through storytelling, consensus, and ceremony, not just technical reports. The September 2023 Indigenous Knowledge Statement laid out the core principles. Salmon restoration could only succeed if led by those who had lived with the river the longest. Each step, from habitat preparation to the timing of the release, was rooted in both ancient teachings and new science. The blueprint was set. The next challenge would be to put it into action. On a cool spring morning in 2023, the banks of the Upper Columbia near Castlegar filled with voices, song, and the steady beat of drums. Community members gathered in a circle, elders and children side by side. This was more than a scientific trial. It was a complete homecoming, witnessed by those whose families had waited generations for this day. About 10,000 sockeye salmon fry, each no longer than a finger, glinted in the morning light. Before their journey began, each fish was tagged, a tiny 12mm marker beneath the skin, nearly invisible but vital for tracking their path. The tags would carry the memory of this place with them, a silent promise that some would one day return. The ceremony unfolded with prayers and gratitude, offered in the languages of the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Katunaxa. Some participants scattered cedar boughs on the water, others sang ancestral songs. The release was careful and deliberate. Children crouched at the water's edge, their hands steady as they let the fry slip into the current. Each release was an act of hope, a message sent downstream that the river was ready to welcome its salmon home again. As the last fry darted into the cold water, a hush settled over the crowd. The journey ahead would be perilous. Hundreds of kilometers, dozens of obstacles, and the vast uncertainty of the ocean. But for the first time in more than 80 years, the Upper Columbia was alive with possibility. In the heat of summer 2025, a monitoring station at Wells Dam in Washington picked up a signal that no one had expected so soon. The PIT tag reader, buried in the concrete fish ladder, flashed a code, then another. 2 adult sockeye, tagged as fry in the Upper Columbia 2 years earlier, had made the impossible journey home. Staff stared at the readout, double-checked the tag numbers against the 2023 release list. There was no mistake. These were the first salmon in more than 80 years to return from ocean to the Upper Columbia against all odds. Word spread from the control room to biologists and community leaders. For a moment, the room hung in disbelief. The river's pulse, silent for generations, had sent a message back. The salmon remembered the way. Celebrations swept through the Upper Columbia as news of the sockeye's return spread. In community halls and riverside gatherings, elders who once spoke only of loss now shared stories of hope. Children danced and sang beside the water, their faces painted with salmon scales, while leaders from the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Katunaxa nations offered thanks in their languages. Drummers kept a steady rhythm as people embraced, some in tears, others laughing in disbelief. For many, it felt like a promise finally kept, not just to ancestors, but to generations yet to come. Chief Keith Crow called it a moment of healing, saying the salmon belong here. And with ceremony, Indigenous knowledge, Western science, and determination, we are bringing them home. Scientists and guardians stood side by side, their efforts validated in a way that data alone could never capture. The river, once silent, echoed with celebration. Today, 2 salmon made it home, but thousands more still face impossible barriers. As governments update the Columbia River Treaty, the world watches. Because restoring a river is not just about fish. It's about reviving a living system and deciding what futures we dare to imagine. What future would you choose?